Japan and Korea Republic are ranked number 1 and number 3 respectively in our ranking. And this is because of all of the 3 components of total compensation: cash compensation, benefits, and taxation levels. All 3 of these are relatively high in comparison to elsewhere in the region. So for example, if we look at cash compensation, a person assigned to either Japan or Korea Republic would receive a relatively high cost of living allowance, reflecting the fact that in either of these locations, the cost of living is high in comparison to elsewhere in the region. Secondly, benefits costs are also relatively high as well. Taking Japan as an example, although housing costs are not as high as they are in Hong Kong, they are still relatively high. So therefore, companies employing expatriates in Japan would also face relatively high benefits costs, and that also applies to Korea Republic. And finally, because these are 2 locations with relatively high tax burdens, this also pushes up the relative cost of employing an expatriate versus all other locations in the region. Well, firstly, it's important to note that although companies are still sending staff into Japan, they're sending staff into Japan in relatively fewer numbers in comparison to elsewhere in the region. So for example, expatriate numbers are generally lower in Japan versus other major Asian destinations such as Beijing, Shanghai, Hong Kong, and Singapore. Also, it's important to note that when companies are sending staff into Japan, they're only really sending them in relatively senior capacity. So we're looking at more middle managerial, senior managerial capacity, where multinationals are sending staff in to Japan because they need people with certain skills, certain corporate leadership, which they may not be able to find locally. Whereas at more junior levels, companies are typically not sending expatriates into Japan because multinationals can generally find the skills and talents locally within the market, and also because of the relatively high cost of sending staff into Japan, companies would generally tend only to do so when they really need to move staff, when skills and experience are not available locally.